The first thing people noticed about the Velvet Hour was that it had no clocks. 3 floors beneath the lacquered streets of Shinjuku, where the neon bled red and violet through frosted glass, and the air tasted of smoke and money, time did not exist. The club breathed in low jazz and exhaled cigarette haze. Men who could end a stranger's life with a phone call sat in velvet booths and laughed too softly. And at the center of it all, raised on a black dais, beneath a single hanging light, sat a grand piano the color of midnight, and the woman who played it. For 2 years, the Velvet Hour had a rule no one dared break. When the pianist played, the boss was calm. When the music stopped even for a breath too long, the boss went somewhere no one could follow, somewhere behind his own eyes. And the men who had been with him longest learned to lower their gaze and pray the song came back. That was why, on the night the pianist finally rose from the bench, looked the most feared man in Tokyo directly in the eyes, and walked away without a single note, the whole underworld held its breath. Because Kaito Arima did not chase her. He stood, he watched her go. And then he reached for the lamp, the cigarettes, the 30 years of empire he had built on blood and silence, and he let it all burn. To understand why a man would set fire to everything he owned, rather than reach out his hand, you have to go back. Back to the night she arrived, back to the song she was never taught, back to the worst night of his life. A night that had everything to do with her. Act 1. The Cage of Music. 2 years earlier, Yuki Tachibana had been nobody. She played piano in the half-empty lounge of a business hotel near Ueno Station, the kind of place where salarymen drank away their failures, and no one ever looked at the woman in the corner making the loneliness beautiful. She was 26, with steady hands and a stillness about her that men found either soothing or unnerving. She had no family she spoke of. Her past was a closed door she had stopped trying to open years ago, a childhood that ended in smoke and noise she could never quite remember, leaving only a strange compulsion in her fingers, and a song she could not name. She had played that song exactly once in public, a nocturne, slow, descending, unbearably tender a melody that lived in her hands without ever having lived in her memory. She did not know where she'd learned it. She only knew that when she played it, something inside her chest pulled tight like grief for a person she had never met. So she rarely played it. It frightened her. But one rainy Tuesday, alone in the lounge, with no one listening, she played it anyway. She did not notice the man in the doorway. He was not supposed to be there. Kaito Arima did not frequent business hotels. He had come to settle a debt with a manager who had borrowed from the wrong people. And he had been walking out into the rain when the sound stopped him, as surely as a hand around his throat. He stood in the doorway, soaked, motionless. And when Yuki finally looked up and saw him, a tall man in a black coat, water dripping from his hair, his face carved from something colder than stone, she felt her hands go still on the keys. He crossed the room without a sound. He stopped at the edge of the piano, and he looked at her, the way a drowning man looks at the surface of the water. "Where?" he said quietly. "Did you learn that song?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I've never been able to remember." Something moved behind his eyes. She would spend the next 2 years trying to name what it was. It was not desire. It was not cruelty. It was something far more dangerous. Recognition. "You'll play it for me," he said. It was not a question. "I work here," she said. "I'm not." "You don't work here anymore." He set a card on the lid of the piano, black on black. No name, only a number. "By morning, the debts of this hotel will be forgiven, and the manager you've been afraid of will be gone. You'll come and play at my club. You'll be paid more in a week than you've made in a year." He paused, and his voice dropped lower, and for one instant, the cold cracked, and she saw something raw underneath. "And you'll be safe, safer than you've ever been in your life. And if I say no," he looked at her for a long moment, "then I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I heard that song one last time and let it walk away." She should have run. Every instinct told her this man was something to be feared, but she was tired and poor and alone, and there was something in the way he had looked at her, not as if she were a woman to be owned, but as if she were a door he had been searching for his whole life. She went. The Velvet Hour swallowed her whole. She understood within a week what kind of place she had entered. The men who came were not businessmen. The deference she was shown was not warmth. And the boss, Kaito Arima, was not a man. He was a weather system. When he entered a room, the temperature dropped. Conversations died. Powerful, terrible men straightened their spines like schoolboys. They said he had no heart. They said he had buried it a decade ago in the ashes of his own family. They said the Arima syndicate had once been the most feared in Kanto, until a single night of fire reduced it to a name, and that Kaito had spent 10 years rebuilding it from a corpse, brick by bloody brick, into something even crueler than before. They said he had killed his own lieutenant for hesitating. They said he had never, not once, been seen to smile. And they said one more thing in whispers when they thought no one could hear. When the girl plays the boss is human. When she stops run. Yuki did not believe it at first, but she began to notice. She played every night, 6 hours, sometimes 8, in the soft pool of light at the center of the room. And Kaito Arima sat in the same booth, in the shadows, a glass of whiskey untouched before him, his eyes closed, listening. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her with the hunger she had braced herself for. He simply listened, as though the music were keeping something at bay, as though each note were a single brick in a wall holding back a flood. And on the rare nights she finished too early, or her hands cramped, or she stopped to drink water for too long, she would feel it. The room would change. The men would go quiet. And across the haze, she would see Kaito's eyes open. And in them was a darkness so total, so bottomless, that she would put her hands back on the keys before she even knew she had decided to. She told herself she was a prisoner. It was easier than the truth she could not yet see. The apartment they gave her was the most beautiful prison imaginable. A glass eyrie, 40 floors above the city, with a piano by the window and a wardrobe full of clothes in her exact size, that had appeared before she ever gave anyone her measurements. There were 2 guards in the lobby at all hours. The car that took her to the club and back was armored. She was never permitted to walk the streets alone. "Why can't I leave?" she asked him once in the 3rd month, when he came to inspect the piano in her apartment, the only times he ever spoke to her outside the club. He was quiet for a long time, his back to her, his hand resting on the closed lid of the instrument. "Because there are men in this city who would hurt you to hurt me," he said at last. "And I will burn this whole world to the ground before I let that happen. You barely know me." He turned then, and the look on his face stopped her breath. "I have known you longer than you think." He left before she could ask what he meant. But that night she could not sleep, because for the first time she had heard it, not possession in his voice, not the cold appetite of a man who wanted to own a beautiful thing. She had heard fear. What in the world could a man like Kaito Arima possibly be afraid of? Act 2. The Man Who Doesn't Sleep. The fascination came slowly the way frost forms on glass invisible, until suddenly the whole pain has changed. She began to watch him the way he watched her. She noticed that he never slept. The lights in his office above the club burned until dawn. She noticed that he ate almost nothing, that he flinched barely a muscle in his jaw whenever a glass shattered or a door slammed. She noticed that on certain nights, the nights when the moon was thin and the rain came down hard, his hands trembled around his untouched whiskey. And on those nights, he needed the music more than ever, and she found herself playing longer, softer, for reasons she could not explain, even to herself. She was supposed to hate him. She was a prisoner. And yet, one night a man came into the club, drunk and angry, a mid-level boss from a smaller family, and he made his way to the dais and put his hand on Yuki's shoulder and said something low and filthy into her ear. She never even saw Kaito move. One moment he was a shadow in his booth. The next, the drunk man was on his knees on the floor, Kaito's hand around his throat, Kaito's face an inch from his utterly calm, utterly without anger, which was somehow infinitely more terrifying than rage would have been. "You touched her," Kaito said softly, as if remarking on the weather. "Do you understand what you've done?" The man made a sound that was not a word. "There are 3 things in this world I protect," Kaito went on, his voice never rising. "My name, my territory, and her. You will never come within 100 meters of this club again, and you will tell every man who serves you why." He released him. The man fell, gasping. "Get out, before I change my mind about letting you keep the hand." When it was over, Kaito straightened his cuffs and turned and looked at Yuki, and for one unguarded instant, before the cold mask slid back down, she saw the truth of him naked on his face. He was not a man defending his property. He was a man who had failed to protect someone once, and would die before he failed again. "Play," he said quietly. Her hands were shaking, but she played. And as the nocturne filled the smoke-thick air, she watched the tremor leave his shoulders, watched the storm recede from behind his eyes, and understood with a chill that ran the length of her spine. I am not his entertainment. I am his medicine. and he is terrified of running out. The almost moments accumulated like snow. The night her fingers bled, she'd played through a cracked nail and not noticed until the keys were spotted red, and he crossed the room and took her hand in both of his, and for one impossible second, the most dangerous man in Tokyo cradled her trembling fingers as though they were made of glass, as though they were the only fragile thing left in a world of iron. He lifted her hand, and his mouth was so close to her skin, and his breath was unsteady, and she felt the whole room tilt. And then he stopped. He set her hand down gently and stepped back, and the mask came down so hard she heard it. "You'll rest the hand for a week," he said. "The music can wait. You hate it when the music stops," she said. "I hate," he said very quietly, "the thought of you in pain more." He left. She sat alone at the piano, her bleeding hand in her lap, and realized she had stopped being afraid of him somewhere along the way, and that this was far more dangerous than fear had ever been. There was the night of the storm, when the power failed across half the city, and the club went black, and in the darkness she heard him cross to her, felt him sit beside her on the bench, his shoulder against hers, and in the dark his voice came low and stripped of all its armor. "Keep playing, please, don't stop." And she played in the pitch black, the nocturne pouring out of her, and somewhere in the second movement she felt his hand find hers in the dark, not gripping, just resting over it, as if to make sure she was real. And neither of them spoke of it when the lights came back. And there was the night she finally asked him the question that had been burning in her for a year. "That song," she said, "the one you made me promise to play every night. You know it, don't you? You knew it before you ever heard me." He went very still. "You react to it like it's a person," she pressed, "like it's a ghost. Whose is it, Kaito? Who taught me a song I don't remember learning?" For a long, long moment, she thought he might finally tell her. His mouth opened, something moved in his throat, and then a phone buzzed in his pocket, and his face changed, not to the cold mask, but to something far worse, something white and sharp and lethal. He read the message. He stood. "Go up to your apartment," he said. "Now. And don't come down no matter what you hear. Kaito." Now Yuki. It was the first time he had ever raised his voice to her, and in it she heard not anger but pure animal terror. The war had begun. Act 3. The Fracture. His name was Daisuke Saiki, and he had come back from the dead. Yuki pieced the truth together in fragments over the terrible weeks that followed, from overheard phone calls, from the new locks on every door, from the way Kaito's men suddenly carried themselves like soldiers expecting to die. 10 years ago, the Saeki Kai had tried to wipe the Arima family from the earth. They had nearly succeeded. There had been a fire, the whisper everyone in the club knew not to speak of, and afterward the Arima name had been smoke, and a single surviving son who clawed his way back to power on a debt of vengeance. For a decade, there had been an uneasy peace, the Saeki Kai content with the territory they'd seized. But Daisuke Saiki was old now, and dying, and he had decided to settle the one piece of unfinished business that had haunted him for 10 years. There was a loose end from the night of the fire, a witness, a survivor he had believed dead, and he had finally learned that she was alive, and that Kaito Arima had been hiding her in plain sight on a dais beneath a single light for 2 years. Yuki did not understand yet that the survivor was her. She only understood that the man who had caged her would not eat, would not sleep, would not leave the club, that he had moved a cot into his office and surrounded her glass apartment with armed men, that he looked at her now with a desperation that bordered on madness. "Send me away," she begged him one night. "If staying near you is putting me in danger, send me far away. Give me a new name. Let me disappear." "No." The word came out of him like something torn. "Why not, if you actually cared about keeping me safe?" "Because I let someone walk into the dark alone once," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. Broke completely, and she saw to her horror that his eyes were wet. "And she didn't come back. I will keep you where I can see you, where I can reach you until I am dead. Do you understand me? You don't leave my sight. Not for her. Not for anyone. Not again. Not again." The same 2 words, the same ghost. She almost reached for him then. She almost crossed the last inch between them. But the door opened, and a lieutenant said the word that froze them both. "They're here!" And the night turned to fire and noise. It happened in the alley behind the club, where the armored car waited. They had decided to move her to a safe house at last, in the dead hours before dawn. Kaito walked beside her, his hand at the small of her back, his men forming a wall of black suits around them. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the neon to running watercolor, and Yuki remembered thinking how beautiful it was. How strange that the most frightening night of her life should be so beautiful. And then the world cracked open. The muzzle flashes came from the rooftop across the alley, white strobes in the rain, and the sound was enormous, and 2 of Kaito's men went down before anyone could react. And the air was full of screaming and broken glass, and the sick, wet sound of bullets finding bodies. And Kaito turned and threw himself over her. He did not pull her behind him. He did not push her toward the car. He wrapped his entire body around hers and drove her down to the wet concrete and covered her, made himself a shield of flesh and bone, and she felt him jerk, once, twice, heard the breath punch out of him, and still he did not let go. Still he pressed her into the ground beneath the cage of his body, while his men returned fire above them, and the rain came down, and his blood ran warm over her hands. "Stay down," he breathed against her ear. "Stay down. I have you. I have you." The gunfire stopped. The shooters fled. And in the sudden ringing silence, Yuki rolled out from beneath him and saw what he had done. He had taken a bullet in the shoulder and another along his ribs. He was soaked in rain and blood, his white shirt gone crimson, his face gray. And when his men ran to him, he waved them off with a bloody hand, and reached instead for her, ran his hands frantically over her face, her arms, her body, searching for a wound that wasn't there. "You're not hit," he said, half disbelieving. "Tell me you're not hit. I'm fine. Kaito, you're shot. You have to—" "Then it doesn't matter," he said, and slumped back against the wet brick, the rain washing pink rivulets down the alley. Then nothing else matters. She would never forget the image of it as long as she lived. The most feared man in Tokyo, bleeding out in a neon alley in the rain, who had used his own body as a shield without a half-second's hesitation, looking up at her with naked relief because she was unhurt. Not relief at his own survival, relief at hers. She did not let his men carry him. She carried him, half-dragged him into the car, his blood soaking through her dress, his head against her shoulder, and she held the wound closed with her bare hands the whole way to the doctor, who asked no questions, and she did not let go of his hand, even when they put the needle in his arm, even when he lost consciousness, even when the doctor told her he would live. She sat beside the bed all night, and in the gray light before dawn, when she thought he was still unconscious, she leaned close and whispered the question that had haunted her for 2 years. "Who am I to you? What am I to you that you'd die for me?" And his hand tightened on hers, and without opening his eyes, he answered, "You're the one thing," he breathed. "I didn't lose in the fire." Act 4. The Hidden Room. She found it 3 days later. Kaito was recovering in his quarters above the club, sedated and guarded. The Velvet Hour was closed for the first time in 2 years, and Yuki, unable to sleep, unable to play, unable to stop hearing those words, "The one thing I didn't lose in the fire," went looking for the truth he would not give her. His office, the one room she had never been allowed to enter. The door was locked, but in the chaos of the past days, a key had been left on a hook, and her hands, those traitor hands that knew songs they were never taught, found it, and turned it, and pushed the door open into the dark. She expected ledgers, weapons, the machinery of an empire. What she found, when she found the light, made her sink slowly to her knees. The walls were covered, not with maps of territory or photographs of enemies, with her. Photographs of Yuki, hundreds of them, thousands, spanning years she didn't remember being photographed. Yuki at the hotel piano in Ueno. Yuki walking in the rain. Yuki asleep. Yuki laughing at something off camera. Yuki as a young woman, a teenager, a girl. The photographs went back. They went back, impossibly far. There were images of her at 15, at 12, at 10. There were images of a small child, 5, perhaps 6, that she did not recognize as herself until she saw the old burn scar on the child's wrist, the small white crescent she had carried her whole life and never known the origin of. He had been watching her, not for 2 years, for a decade. He had found her after the fire, and he had never once let her out of his sight. From a distance had paid for her piano lessons through anonymous foundations, had bought the hotel she played in, had arranged her entire life, like a man tending a single flame in a vast and terrible dark. And she had never known. And in the center of the wall, framed in black, was a photograph that stopped her heart. A young woman at a grand piano, beautiful, maybe 19, with Kaito's exact eyes. And beneath the photograph, in a hand she somehow recognized, was a sheet of music, handwritten, yellowed, half-burned at one corner. It was the nocturne, her nocturne, the song that lived in her hands and not her memory. And at the top of the page in faded ink was a name, Kaito Arima, and a dedication written by a sister to no one in particular, written years before Yuki was ever caged. For the little one who liked to fall asleep under the piano, may she always have music, may she always be safe. The door opened behind her. Kaito stood in the frame, gray-faced, one arm in a sling, having dragged himself up 3 flights of stairs against every order. He looked at her, kneeling among the photographs of her own stolen life, and he did not try to hide it anymore. There was nothing left to hide. "You weren't supposed to find this," he said softly. "Not like this. Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me what I am." And finally, at last, in a room papered with the evidence of a decade of silent devotion, Kaito Arima told her the truth. Act 5, the night she stopped playing. Her name was Aiko, he said, lowering himself to the floor beside her because he could no longer stand. "My sister. She was 19. She was the best of us, the only good thing the Arima name ever produced. She was going to leave it all behind, go to Vienna, play piano for people who had never heard the word Yakuza in their lives." He looked at the photograph, and 10 years of grief moved across his face like a tide. There was a club, our father's club, smaller than this one, older. On the nights Aiko played, the whole family came, and there was a little girl who lived in the rooms above it, the daughter of the woman who ran the kitchen, a quiet child who liked music, who used to crawl under the piano while Aiko played and fall asleep there, because it was the only place in that whole violent world that felt safe. Yuki's hands had begun to shake. "Aiko loved that child," Kaito said. "She wrote her a song, a lullaby really dressed up as a nocturne. She taught it to her over a whole summer note by note, so the girl could play herself to sleep when Aiko was gone to Vienna." His voice was unbearably gentle now and unbearably broken. The girl was 6 years old. She learned the whole thing. She used to play it with her little hands, and Aiko would laugh and call her a prodigy. "Kaito," Yuki breathed. "Stop. Please stop." "The Saiki Kai came on a night in November," he went on, relentless because she had to know, because he had carried this alone for 10 years. "They came to take our father's territory, and they decided the cleanest way was to take everyone in the club at once. They locked the doors. They started the fire." His hand found the burned corner of the sheet music. "I was 18. I was outside in the car, sent on an errand because I was the youngest, and I sulked about it. I came back and the building was already burning, and the doors wouldn't open, and I could hear them inside. I could hear her, Aiko, playing. They were dying, and my sister was playing the piano, playing that song, playing it so the little girl wouldn't be afraid, so the last thing the child heard wouldn't be screaming." He stopped. He could not speak for a moment. Yuki was weeping now, silently, because she knew. God help her, she knew. "I broke a window in the back. I couldn't reach Aiko, the fire was between us. But I could reach the storeroom, and there, hidden under the floor where her sister had pushed her, where Aiko had shoved her down into the dark in the last seconds and told her to be quiet and wait for the music to stop, there was the little girl." He looked at Yuki, and the whole decade of it was in his eyes. "I pulled you out, Yuki. You burned your wrist on the window frame coming through. You were unconscious from the smoke, and I carried you 3 streets away and gave you to a hospital and told them I'd found you in the road because I was 18 and the heir to a dead family and I had 100 enemies, and the safest thing in the world for you was to never, ever be connected to the name Arima." And the song stopped, Yuki whispered. The memory was coming now, breaking through 10 years of merciful dark, the heat, the locked door, the gentle hands pushing her down. "Be quiet, little one. Wait for the music to stop." And the music never stopping, not until the very end. The song stopped, and I forgot everything. I forgot her face. I forgot the fire. I only kept the song in my hands. I kept her song in my hands, and I never knew why. "You were the one thing I saved," Kaito said. "The one life I pulled out of that fire when I couldn't save my own sister. Every brick of this empire, every terrible thing I've done in 10 years, I told myself it was for revenge, but it wasn't. It was so I would have the power to keep one promise. May she always be safe. I have watched over you from the shadows your whole life, Yuki. And 2 years ago, when I heard you playing Aiko's song in a hotel lounge, when I heard my dead sister's love coming out of your living hands. I couldn't do it from the shadows anymore. I had to bring you in. I had to know you were safe, where I could see you." He bowed his head. "And every night you play that song, the silence in my head goes quiet, because the silence is the moment the music stopped. The silence is my sister dying. And you give the song back to me, every single night." The room was very quiet. "I never caged you because I wanted to own you," he said. "I caged you because I have spent 10 years terrified of the silence where your music used to be. Because you are the only proof that the worst night of my life produced one single thing of good. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have let you go. But I couldn't. I couldn't let the music stop again." And here is the cruelty of the truth. It did not free her. It crushed her. Because for 2 years she had built her survival on a story. I am a prisoner. I am a possession. This man is a monster who keeps me for sport. And now the story was rubble, and beneath it was something unbearable. She was the reason a girl had been orphaned of her sister's love. She was the survivor of a fire that killed everyone who'd ever sheltered her. She had spent 10 years free and ignorant, while this broken man stood guard over her life in the dark, asking nothing, taking nothing, simply watching the flame. The weight of it was more than the cage had ever been. She had to get out, not from the cage, from the truth, from him, from the song. She came down to the club that night. The Velvet Hour reopened. The men back at their posts, the haze and the neon in the booth where Kaito sat pale and bandaged, watching her with his whole ruined heart in his eyes. She sat at the piano. She put her hands on the keys, and she could not play. For the first time in 2 years, she lifted her hands from the piano, and she stood. And across the smoke-thick room, she met Kaito Arima's eyes, and she let the silence fall. The whole club felt it. The men went still. The temperature dropped. The single light over the dais seemed to flicker, and Kaito did not move, did not speak, did not reach for her. He simply watched her, and she watched him, and the silence stretched between them like a wound. The silence he had spent 10 years holding back, the silence that was his sister dying, and she made him stand in it. And she walked away. She walked across the floor, past the frozen men, up the stairs, out into the rain. And she waited for him to come after her, to chase her, to drag her back to do the monstrous thing the story had told her he would do. He did not come. She stood across the street in the downpour, soaked to the skin, and she watched the doors of the Velvet Hour. And Kaito Arima did not come. What came instead was light. It started low, in the windows of the club, a warm orange that did not belong, that grew, that climbed. And then she understood, and her heart turned to ice in her chest, because she had heard this story before. She had lived this story before. A club, a fire, the people inside. But the men were coming out, all of them, filing out into the rain in their black suits, unhurt, looking back over their shoulders at something they could not believe. And behind them, the fire grew and grew, devouring the velvet and the neon, and the bottles and the booths, the whole gleaming empire Kaito Arima had spent a decade building out of grief and vengeance. And at the center of it, through the smoke, through the flames, climbing the walls, she could see him. He was standing perfectly still on the dais, in the heart of the fire, beside the burning piano. He had said it himself. He was burning it all down, every brick of the empire, every monument to the revenge that had consumed 10 years of his life. And he was not running. He was standing in the silence and the fire that had haunted him, and choosing it, choosing to walk into the thing he feared most, rather than do what the psyche had done, rather than chase her into the dark, rather than be the monster who locked the doors. He was setting her free the only way he knew how, by burning the cage, by burning himself. And Yuki understood all at once, standing in the rain, he was not going to come out. The men were carrying one thing through the smoke, 4 of them, struggling, coughing, hauling it out into the street in the rain, the black grand piano. Aiko's piano, the only thing he had told them to save. He had saved the music, and he meant to stay with the silence. She did not remember crossing the street. She remembered being inside the fire, the heat tearing at her, the men shouting her name, and Kaito turning on the burning dais to see her there, his face going white with horror. "No, Yuki, no! Get out! Get out!" And she remembered reaching him, gripping the front of his shirt with both of her piano hands, screaming up into his ruined face, over the roar of the flames. "You don't get to do this," she screamed. "You don't get to save me and then leave. You don't get to be the only one who carries it." She pushed me into the dark and told me to wait for the music to stop. Well, I waited 10 years, and I'm done waiting. And the music doesn't have to stop, Kaito. Do you hear me? It doesn't have to stop. "There's nothing left," he said, and the fire was in his eyes, and a decade of grief was finally cracking open all the way down. The empire, the revenge, all of it. It was the only thing holding me together, and I burned it, because I would rather be ash than be a man who cages you. "Then be ash with me," she said, "or come out with me, but you don't leave me in the dark again." And she pulled. And the most feared man in Tokyo, who had stood unflinching against 100 guns, who had taken bullets without a sound, let a pianist drag him out of the fire by the front of his shirt, out through the smoke and the collapsing neon, out into the rain. The velvet hour burned to the ground behind them. The empire died in the downpour, and in the street, soaked and trembling and alive, Yuki Tachibana took Kaito Arima's blood and ash-streaked face in both of her hands, the hands that still knew his sister's song, and held him while the whole of his old life turned to embers. He was no longer a boss. There was no empire left to rule. He was just a man on his knees in the rain, weeping for the first time in 10 years, holding on to the one thing he had ever managed to save. "The silence," he said brokenly. "If you ever stop playing the silence, I'm not going to play to hold it back anymore," she said. And she was crying too, and smiling, which made no sense, except that it made all the sense in the world. "I'm going to play because I want to, for you, not because you keep me, because I choose to stay." She pressed her forehead to his. "Aiko gave me the song, so I'd never be afraid in the dark. So let me give it back to you, every night, not as a prisoner, as the woman who's done watching you carry it alone." Epilogue. The little one who liked to fall asleep under the piano. They left Tokyo before the embers were cold. There was no empire to inherit, and no revenge left to take. The fire had burned both. Daisuke Saiki, old and dying and robbed of the one loose end he'd waited a decade to tie off, learned that the Arima name had vanished from the earth a second time, this time by its own hand, and the survivor with it. There was nothing left to hunt. A ghost cannot be killed twice. Within a year, Saiki was dead, and the war that had defined two families ended not with a bullet, but with an absence, with two people no one could find. They surfaced eventually in a small city by the sea, on the other side of the world, where the rain came soft, and no one had ever heard the word Yakuza. He had quietly moved a fortune ahead of them, the only inheritance he kept, not the empire, only the means to disappear into an ordinary life. He learned to sleep again. It took a long time. Some nights the silence still came for him, and on those nights he would wake to find her already at the piano in the dark, playing Aiko's Nocturne, and he would go and sit beside her on the bench, the way he had in the blackout, years before, his shoulder against hers, and let the music close the wound one more time. But it came less and less. Because the song was no longer a wall against the dark, it had become something else. It had become theirs. She kept the half-burned sheet of music framed above the piano, the one in Aiko's hand. For the little one who liked to fall asleep under the piano, may she always have music. May she always be safe. She was. At last, after everything, she was. On the morning he finally asked her to marry him, he did not do it with words. He could never do anything with words. They had failed him his whole life. He simply set Aiko's burned sheet of music on the piano, and beneath it, in his own careful hand, he had written a new dedication. "For the woman who pulled me out of the fire, may we always have music, may the silence never come again." And Yuki Tachibana, who had once believed she was a prisoner, who had spent 2 years afraid of the man who had spent 10 years keeping her safe from the shadows, sat down at the piano in the soft sea light and played the song her hands had never forgotten. Not because anyone was holding back the dark, not because anyone was caged, but because she was home, and she was loved, and the most feared man in the world had burned down his entire empire just to set her free. Outside, the rain came down gentle on a quiet street, washing the world clean. And the music did not stop.